Today, pizza is a global industry. Restaurants, chains, and frozen products together earn many billions of dollars a year. It fills the supermarket freezer aisle. It carries the names of chains with tens of thousands of stores. It arrives at your door in a branded box, treated as a small everyday luxury on a slow evening. For most of its history, it was almost the opposite of that. In the crowded alleys of Naples in the 1800s, pizza was the food you ate because you had nothing better. It was flour, a little fat, and whatever cheap topping the day allowed. It was sold in the street, eaten standing up, by people who could not afford a kitchen, let alone a restaurant. That is the strange thing about pizza. The food the world now sells as comfort was, for generations, tied to poverty. It belonged to the crowded streets of Naples and to the people who lived from one day's earnings to the next. So how did a food that began at the very bottom end up conquering the entire world? And when it finally did, who actually got rich from it? To understand pizza, you have to start with a city that was, for a long time, one of the largest and most unequal in Europe. By the late 1700s and into the 1800s, Naples was enormous by the standards of its day, a crowded port packed with hundreds of thousands of people. A large share of them lived in single rooms, without ovens, without much money, and often without steady work. Contemporary observers often called part of the city's poor the Lazzaroni, a loaded and sometimes derogatory label for the casual laborers, street sellers, and marginalized people who survived on whatever work they could find. For many of these households, cooking every meal at home was impractical. There was no hearth big enough, no fuel to spare, no money to store food that might spoil before it was eaten. What such a household needed was food it could buy in tiny amounts, eat immediately, and afford on almost nothing. Naples had the makings of exactly that. Sitting on the sea with a steady grain trade, it had ready access to flour, inexpensive seasonings, and a strange red fruit that grew well in the southern sun. That fruit was the tomato, which ordinary southern cooks had embraced long before it was fully welcome at elite European tables. That combination of a large, working, poor, cheap flatbread and an ingredient the elite still regarded with suspicion is where modern pizza actually comes from. Not a royal kitchen and not formal court cuisine, but the everyday demands of a crowded city where a great many people could not afford the fuel, space, or equipment to cook for themselves. Flatbreads themselves are ancient and were never Neapolitan. People across the Mediterranean and the Middle East had been baking flat rounds of dough and dressing them with oil, herbs, and cheese for thousands of years. So it is more accurate to say that Naples did not invent the flatbread. What Naples did was turn a cheap topped flatbread into a specific street food for the urban poor, and give it the shape we would recognize today. The early Neapolitan pizza was a working person's calculation. A baker or a street seller made the dough, baked it fast in a hot wood-fired oven, and topped it simply. In the earliest versions, the toppings were plain, oil, garlic, lard, a little cheese, herbs. Later, as the tomato spread through southern Italy, a version topped with tomato became common. It was food designed around one question: how do you feed a hungry person quickly, cheaply, and without a plate? The answer shaped everything about it. Pizza was sold from open front shops and from the street. In some accounts, sellers carried it through the alleys in insulated tin boxes, calling out to passing workers, and customers bought it on a kind of informal credit, folding it in the hand and paying in the smallest coins. This was cooking as arithmetic. The pizza was defined less by what was on it than by what could be left off, every ingredient forced to justify its price against an empty pocket. There was one more reason pizza belonged to the street rather than the home. When you have no oven, you cannot bake. So the cooking was pushed out of the house and into the shop, where a seller with a hot oven could feed a whole neighborhood that had none. The vendor was not just selling food, he was renting out the one thing his customers could not afford: heat. Picture the Neapolitan street vendor at the heart of this. Not a celebrated chef, but a poor man selling to poorer men on thin margins in a crowded port city. Vendors like him turned pizza into daily food, yet their income stayed tied to the few coins in each sale. Hold on to that image. The oven, the cellar, and those few coins will look very different once pizza becomes an industry. But before pizza could travel anywhere, one ingredient had to transform it, a red fruit that, for generations, parts of Europe's elite had regarded with suspicion. For much of the 1800s, pizza carried a reputation problem. Travel writers who passed through Naples sometimes described the food of the poor with open distaste, and to many outside observers, pizza seemed inseparable from the city's crowded streets and hunger. The tomato at its center did not help. It had arrived from the Americas centuries earlier, and in parts of Europe it was long treated with suspicion by the upper classes. They grew it as an ornamental curiosity and were slow to let it reach respectable tables, even though ordinary people in the South had been eating it for generations. A food built on cheap dough and a once distrusted fruit was easy to look down on. But here is where the tidy story of a despised peasant food breaks down. Pizza never stayed only in the alleys. As early as the 1700s, King Ferdinand IV had a pizza oven installed at his summer palace at Capodimonte, and lesser aristocrats followed his lead. In 1860, a correspondent for London's Morning Post called pizza Naples's great social leveler, describing the pizzerias as almost the only places where the proud Neapolitan nobility could be seen eating beside their own coachmen, valets, and barbers. Pizza was tied to poverty in its reputation, but in practice it had already crossed the lines between classes. That gap between what pizza was assumed to be and who actually ate it is the real setup for what comes next. Pizza did not need a queen to enter a palace, it was already there. What it did not yet have was a single, memorable story that could turn a street food into a symbol. And in 1889, it seemed to get one. Every food that rises in status seems to acquire an origin story, and pizza has one of the most famous of all. The story goes like this. In 1889, the Italian queen, Margherita, visited Naples. A local pizza maker prepared a pizza in her honor, topped with tomato, mozzarella, and basil, the red, white, and green of the newly unified Italian flag. The queen loved it, and the pizza was named Margherita after her. It is a lovely story. It gives pizza a royal blessing, a patriotic meaning, and a clean birthday. The trouble is what happens when historians look closely. The tale rests largely on a thank you note supposedly sent from the royal household to the pizza maker. Researchers examining it, most prominently the food historian Zachary Nowak, have pointed to discrepancies in its wording, its handwriting, and its royal seal that suggest it may have been produced much later. Just as damaging, pizzas topped with tomato, cheese, and basil are described in Naples before 1889. The famous origin of the Margherita, in other words, is better understood as a widely repeated legend than as established fact. But notice what the story does, regardless of whether it is true. Pizza had already reached palaces. What it lacked was a single story people would repeat. The legend gave it exactly that. It recast pizza's identity, replacing the alley with a queen and turning a humble food into a patriotic symbol of a newly unified Italy. A myth, in this case, did the work that decades of quiet royal appetite never had. It made pizza something a nation could be proud to claim. And pizza was about to need that pride, because at almost the same moment, this story was taking shape. The people who actually made and ate it were leaving Italy in enormous numbers. The single most important thing that ever happened to pizza was not a recipe or a royal visit. It was mass emigration. In the decades around 1900, southern Italy was gripped by deep poverty. The land was poor, taxes and debt pressed hard on rural families, and political unification had not resolved the deep inequality that shaped much of the South. Millions of people made the wrenching decision to leave. Between the 1880s and the 1920s, roughly 4 million Italians emigrated to the United States alone, and a very large share of them came from the poor southern regions, including the area around Naples. These were not, for the most part, prosperous people carrying a celebrated cuisine. Southern Italians in this era were among the poorest arrivals of their time, frequently met with open prejudice, packed into crowded tenement districts, and channeled into the hardest and lowest paid work: construction, mining, dock work, the needle trades. They brought their food not as a luxury, but because it was cheap, familiar, and made from what they could find. In that world, a filling food you already knew how to make was not nostalgia, it was survival, exactly as it had been in Naples. Pizza crossed the ocean in the pockets of people who had almost nothing. In American cities, the first pizzerias served these immigrant communities. The most famous of them, Lombardi's on Spring Street in New York, has long been celebrated as America's first pizzeria, licensed in 1905. Recent research complicates even that story, suggesting other Italian pizza makers came before it. What matters is not the exact first name on a license, but that for a long time such places were neither famous nor fashionable. They were simply where poor Italians ate, made by families working long hours for thin returns. The feel-good version of this history says Italians brought pizza to America and the world fell in love with it. That is not wrong. But it skips the part that matters. Many of the people who carried pizza were poor migrants who faced grinding labor and open prejudice, and whose names were never attached to what they made. Pizza's audience was about to expand beyond anything they could have imagined. Whether the reward would reach them or someone else is the question the rest of this story answers. Pizza had reached America. What it had not yet reached was the American mainstream. Pizza's leap from immigrant neighborhood food to national favorite accelerated sharply after the Second World War, and it happened in America. During the war, large numbers of American soldiers spent time in Italy and came home with a taste for the food. At the same time, the country was changing in ways that suited pizza perfectly. Cities were spreading into suburbs. Car culture was booming. Families had a little more money and were looking for cheap, casual, shared meals they could enjoy out of the house. Pizza fit the moment exactly. Inexpensive, easy to make in volume, easy to sell, and easy to like. The food adapted to serve that market. Gas-fired commercial ovens made it faster to produce in volume than the old wood-burning kind. The cardboard pizza box let a hot pie survive a car ride home, helping pizza takeout expand into a business of its own. Selling it by the slice let a single person buy lunch for pocket change, while selling it by the pie fed a whole family for the price of one restaurant meal. Each of these was a small commercial innovation, and together they turned a neighborhood food into a national product. Pizzerias multiplied far beyond the old Italian districts. Pizza moved into mainstream American eating even as Italian-American families continued to shape its identity, and within a couple of decades, a food that had been an immigrant curiosity became one of the most popular meals in the country. And this is the point where the money in pizza begins, decisively, to change shape. In Naples, the vendor made the food and kept a little. In the immigrant pizzeria, the family made the food and kept a little more, but still worked brutal hours for it. Now a new question appeared. How do you make money not from selling one pizza at a time, but from selling the idea of pizza, everywhere, at once? The first American pizzerias sold food. The next generation would discover how to sell a system, and most of the people who built it had no connection to Naples at all. Two inventions turned pizza from a popular food into a global industry: the freezer aisle and the franchise. Frozen pizza took the food out of the pizzeria entirely. In 1957, the Celentano brothers, who ran an Italian specialty store in New Jersey, began selling a frozen pizza marketed nationally across the United States. One of the first to escape a single neighborhood and reach supermarket freezers everywhere. A few years later, in Minnesota, Rose and Jim Totino turned their successful pizza shop into a frozen pizza line. Their story is more revealing than a simple tale of the little guy losing out. When the food giant Pillsbury bought the Totino brand in 1975, it reportedly paid around $22 million, and Rose Totino became Pillsbury's first female corporate vice president. The founders did not get erased, they got rich. But notice what the sale actually transferred: The Totino's earned a fortune once. At the moment, they sold. Everything the brand produced after that, every frozen pizza, in every freezer, for decades, belonged to a corporation with factories and reached no family restaurant could match. Industrial scale works like this, it can make its founders wealthy and still move the lasting, repeatable income to whoever owns the system. The franchise made that logic even sharper, and you can watch it happen almost from nothing. In 1958, two brothers in Wichita, Kansas, Dan and Frank Carney, borrowed $600 from their mother and opened a small pizzeria they called Pizza Hut. 2 years later, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, Tom Monahan and his brother bought an existing pizza shop for $500. Tom soon traded his brother a used Volkswagen for the other half and renamed it Domino's. Neither began with a uniquely Neapolitan recipe. What they built was a system that could be copied, a name and a look and a way of operating, then sold to other people who would open their own stores under it. A system like that makes money in a way a street seller never could. A Neapolitan street vendor earned once, when he sold a pizza. A franchise company earns from stores it does not run. Under Domino's current standard American agreement, for example, a franchisee pays the company a royalty of 5.5% of the store's sales plus a 6% contribution to national advertising, before the company also earns by supplying much of the food and equipment the store needs. That is money arriving from thousands of kitchens the corporation never has to staff. The result is a layered business, and each layer keeps a different share. The franchisor owns the brand and the system and collects a slice of everything sold under its name. The franchisees put up the money, take on the debt, and run the actual restaurants. And the people in the kitchens and the delivery cars do the daily work for an hourly wage. It is the old Naples arrangement rebuilt at national scale, with the person nearest the oven furthest from the largest rewards. And the scale that logic unlocked is staggering. By 1971, Pizza Hut was the largest pizza chain in the world. By the end of 2025, the Domino's system included more than 22,000 stores worldwide. Roughly 99% of them owned and run by franchisees rather than by the company itself, and the Pizza Hut system counted close to 20,000. A food that began as the meal of people too poor to cook had become one of the most successful prepared foods on earth. So the story's central question comes due, and the honest answer to who got rich is not a single villain. Some of the people who made pizza did get rich: the Totino's, the Carneys, Monahan, countless pizzeria families. What industrial scale really did was change the shape of the reward. The most repeatable income, the kind that keeps arriving long after a single sale, increasingly belonged to whoever owned the brand, the factory, or the franchise system. The people who make and carry the food still earned mostly what a single shift or a single pizza would pay. The value of pizza had been rising for 2 centuries. What changed was not that its makers got nothing. It was that the lasting income went to whoever owned the system, not whoever stood at the oven. Today, pizza is genuinely everywhere. It is sold on every continent, adapted into thousands of local forms, and earns tens of billions of dollars a year across frozen products, chains, and independent shops. The poor man's street food of Naples has conquered the world. It would be too simple to say no one from that world ever benefited. Countless Italian-American families built livelihoods and real independence from a single neighborhood pizzeria. And industrialization made pizza cheaper and more available than any Neapolitan vendor could have dreamed. Naples, too, turned a food long tied to its streets into an official source of cultural pride. In 2017, the art of the Neapolitan pizzuolo, the pizza maker, was added to UNESCO's list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity. The craft the city had always practiced became something the whole world formally recognized, and underneath the pride, the old division of rewards held. A substantial share of the industry's scalable wealth accumulated in the brands, the factories, the suppliers, and the franchise systems, while many of the frontline jobs stayed near the bottom of the pay scale. In the United States, food preparation and serving occupations have a median wage well below the median for all work. 2 centuries after a Neapolitan vendor sold his last coin's worth of dough, much of the daily labor that makes and carries the pizza remains among the lowest paid work in the business it built. Pizza is usually told as a success story, and in one sense it is. A cheap, humble food born of hardship became a shared pleasure for billions. But the fuller history is quieter. Pizza became a global icon not because it was refined or celebrated at the top, but because it was cheap enough to feed the poor, portable enough to travel with the desperate, and simple enough to industrialize. Its makers understood its value perfectly well. Plenty of them grew rich from it. What the companies with factories, capital, and franchise networks could do was scale that value far beyond anything a single oven or a single family ever could. So the next time you pick up a slice, whether from a chain, a freezer, or the shop on the corner, look at what you are actually holding. Not a luxury that trickled down to the masses, but a poverty food that traveled up and divided its rewards unevenly along the way. The slice is cheap. It was always meant to be. And the question it raised in a Neapolitan alley 2 centuries ago is the one the whole industry still answers today. Not who makes the pizza, but who keeps earning from it long after each one is sold.